this lecture, next lecture is going to be about corruption. So what do I want to talk about in corruption? So I want to cover a couple of key ideas about corruption. Okay, the first is, do we care about corruption? So corruption, what is corruption? I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time defining corruption, but we can think of corruption as kind of, various ways in which government officials are exploiting their public office for private benefits. That's a, reasonable definition. Some people could disagree about little aspects of it, but I think it's a reasonable definition. But the first question is, do we even care? Okay, is corruption a problem? And so there's lots of reasons to think that corruption is a, something we might be against for ethical or moral reasons. We don't necessarily want people to be taking advantage of public office for their private benefit. But so putting on our economics hat, there's a question of kind of, is this something that is, beyond kind of the, how bad is this for society, and how do we think about that question? Okay, and so I want to start by thinking about that, and also a little bit on how do we measure corruption. And then I want to think about how corrupt officials kind of decide to be, how corrupt to be, and sort of what do we know about kind of what makes people more or less corrupt. Okay, and that'll be mostly next lecture. Okay, all right. Now, one thing that's important to realize about corruption is it's a little tricky to measure, right? And the basic issue is you can't just ask people kind of like, oh, please tell me how corrupt you are, right? Because they usually won't tell you. That actually is not always the case, but sometimes, often that's the case. So you have to do things that are a little more clever. So part of what I want to do, just sort of kind of to begin, is to show you a couple of examples of how people have tried to measure corruption for research to give you a feel for how this works. Okay, so there are a couple different approaches you can take. One approach is perceptions of corruption. So when you hear how many of you guys have heard of Transparency International? Not that many of you, actually. Okay. So Transparency International is a worldwide NGO, and it ranks countries sort of saying this is the most corrupt. Or how many of you have ever heard a statement saying such and such country is the 130th most corrupt country in the world? Okay. So all of those, almost all of you. So those numbers come from perceptions of corruption. Okay. So what they mean is actually, it's not that, by and large, those numbers are not, oh, we actually measured corruption in some careful, rigorous, data-driven way in 180 countries and ranked them. Instead, there's some other components as well now, but a large fraction of what's in those data is expert surveys, where they go and survey people who do business in all these countries, and they say, well, gee, on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult is the corruption problem in Nigeria, or how difficult is the corruption problem in Zimbabwe, or how difficult is the corruption problem in Denmark, or whatever, and they aggregate all those people's responses and kind of take an average, right? So when you say that, there's some other stuff there as well. There is some survey of actual bribe-paying behavior, which is relatively new, but most of what's going into those data are those perceptions. And it's important to keep in mind that perceptions are not necessarily correct, right? So when someone says it's the 130th most corrupt country in the world, in some sense what they're saying is, when we surveyed other people, they thought it was the 130th most corrupt country in the world. And of course, how did they get their data? Well, part of what they did is they went to those countries and they sort of tried to do business there and whatever. And part of it is they may have read news reports saying this country is really corrupt, or this country is not really corrupt, or whatever. And so it can be a bit self-fulfilling, right? In fact, you could imagine that if I made, all of a sudden I allowed a free press that sort of really actively started reporting on corruption, you might imagine that people would think that country was a lot more corrupt because they know of all these horrible corruption stories. But in fact, the country becomes less corrupt because now now people are worried about all the press scrutiny or whatever. So they don't necessarily go in the same direction. But just worth keeping in mind when you hear those numbers, that's kind of what they are. A second approach that people use is what I call comparing two measures of the same thing. And here, the idea is you want to measure some activity before corruption takes place and after corruption takes place, and then subtract. Okay? So I'll give you a couple examples. And the final thing you can do is sometimes you can actually measure corruption directly, sometimes you can actually ask people what they pay in bribes. And actually, they do tell you. Often, bribe takers will almost never tell you what they take in bribes, but bribe payers actually will often tell you, because in some countries it's not particularly stigmatized. And sometimes you can observe corruption directly in a couple of examples. So let me give you some examples of what this means.